the casualties are in the thousands. And this may, in fact, be the most brutal crackdown in the history of the Islamic Republic. So this is a really major event. The question is how it will unfold moving forward and what's next.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Protests sweeping Iran are unlike anything the regime has faced since coming to power in 1979. What began as demonstrations by shopkeepers in Tehran over the sharply devalued Iranian rial quickly morphed into sustained nationwide anti-government protests. The government responded with extreme brutality, killing thousands of people, and in doing so, once again put itself in the crosshairs of the United States. Donald Trump has publicly encouraged the protesters and is threatening military action against the Iranian government. Could the United States strike Iran yet again? Why are Israel and America's Gulf allies, normally among the loudest advocates for confronting Tehran, suddenly urging restraint? And if the U.S. does launch a strike, how might Iran respond? My guest today, Dalia Dassa Kaye, literally wrote the book on the long and fraught relationship between the United States and Iran. A senior fellow at the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations and author of Enduring Hostility, The Making of America's Iran Policy, she has spent years studying how escalatory cycles between Washington and Tehran unfold. We begin by discussing why this protest movement is fundamentally different from those that came before, and then examine why the military options now being debated in Washington are unlikely to produce their intended results. As the crackdown intensifies in Iran and Trump weighs conducting strikes, this conversation gives you useful context for understanding events as they unfold. We recorded our conversation live via Substack, as I'm doing more and more often with my episodes. I really do love the live video interface that Substack provides. I also think it kind of conveys a sense of urgency to the topic that we're discussing, and it's a little more interactive. I get to see your comments and who pops in the conversation. So please join one of these future live recordings by going to globaldispatches.org and signing up for a subscription. And you can also support the show by getting a paid subscription while you're there. I really do require and need your support, so thank you. Now here is my conversation with Dalia Dassa Kaye, author of the new book, Enduring Hostility, The Making of America's Iran Policy. So we are recording this on Thursday, January 15th. Events are rapidly unfolding both in Iran and in the region and in the White House as well, which, as you know, is designing its response to these protests. To start, though, I would love to have you explain to me and listeners how these protests started and why they seem to have spread so quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty wide consensus at this point that really the trigger for these protests in late December was the collapse of the currency, the rial, and general economic pressure on the population, and not just kind of lower class, but it really hit the middle class. You know, it's very hard to make a living in Iran right now. So this economic pressure combined with social pressure, don't forget, we've had multiple protests in previous years. We have the major Masa Amini protest that focused on the women life freedom movement. So lots of societal tensions and just economic malaise after, poor governance, corruption, and years of economic sanctions. So I think it was a combination of all those factors, general sense that this government is not responding to the people's needs. It's lost legitimacy. There's a feeling that reform is not possible from within anymore. So things just kind of burst. And so they kind of took on a momentum of their own. They started in the bazaar again, focused on the economic, but really became widespread across the country and became really anti-government protests, not just about an economic protest.
Can I ask you about that? I'm glad you brought up the 2022 protests, the women life freedom protests. There's also the 2009 Green Revolution protests, all very large and widespread. But something just seems qualitatively different about these protests. Like, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors, but a big one, you mentioned 2009, that was about kind of a vote that was disputed. So that was still a moment when Iranians still thought they could work in the system to try to bring about change. By 2022, Masa Amini, and there were protests since 2019, many different cycles. But the Masa Amini protest, the Women Life Freedom, was more focused on the women's movement, the hijab, and so forth. And that actually did lead to some changes, not official, but de facto. These really felt different because it was just about everything. It was like about the Islamic regime itself, that this government wasn't working for the people. And then you also, I think, have the added difference that there was this sense of internal crisis with external threats at the same time, because this is coming in the aftermath of the June war, of the so-called 12-day war, the Israeli and U.S. attack on the country, and the reinstatement of UN sanctions in October. So you're having this really massive external crisis at the same time as the internal one. And it just feels like this perfect storm. Of course, I think it's really important for your listeners to understand these things are really unpredictable. Again, protests are not new. The government has enormous, unfortunately, security apparatus and capabilities that are brutally suppressing these protests. That we're getting very little information because of the internet blackout. So it's very fragmented understanding of what's actually happening. So we say all these things with very little information. But I think, credible sources are suggesting at this stage, the casualties are in the thousands. And this may, in fact, be the most brutal crackdown in the history of the Islamic Republic. So this is a really major event. The question is how it will unfold moving forward and what's next. I think the last thing I'd say on the protest is that you're seeing defections or cracks in the leadership. It's very, very hard to topple regimes from outside pressure or unarmed protesters and civil disobedience. It's very, very hard. So unless these things start leading to fractures in the leadership, this could go on a while. So we really don't know. It's quite unpredictable how this will unfold.
You mentioned one big difference this time around is the seemingly very direct involvement of the United States. Can you just describe what the Trump administration has been saying and doing as these events and protests have unfolded in Iran?
Yeah, it's been pretty dramatic. I mean, of course, as, kind of on brand for President Trump, the messages are very mixed. They're really all over the map. But he did come out of the gate very early on with social media postings and other statements, basically threatening the Iranians that if the killing continued, the U.S. would come to the rescue and that the U.S. was locked and loaded. So these were very overt, viewed as military threats to respond. And this is quite different because the June attack, which by itself, I should note, was unprecedented. The U.S., despite now nearly half a century of hostility with Iran, having this adversarial relationship since the revolution in 1979, the U.S. never attacked Iranian territory itself. President Trump in his first administration killed General Soleimani, the IRGC commander, in Iraq. There were, the tanker war in the late 80s, where U.S. blew up oil platforms and so forth. But to attack Iran on its own territory was kind of crossing a line that hadn't been crossed. But now threatening to attack militarily beyond the nuclear question, because that was kind of the main debate about a military attack to try to deal with the nuclear challenge. That was the supposed purpose in June. But now the president's statements over the course of the protest got even more expansive to the point where He basically was calling for Iranian protesters to continue to be out in the streets, to take over institutions, that quote unquote help was on the way. This is language suggesting goals and ambitions that are far more than just protect protesters from because this is about, toppling the regime. So this is kind of new language. This would be new goals. At the same time, just over the last day, the president has kind of reaffirmed Iranian government talking points that the killing has stopped and, is giving himself an off ramp from doing anything. So it's very confused. And I think that's one of the worries about all of this.
Why do you suppose the Trump administration was so quick and eager to make these threats?
It's really, really hard to understand this administration right now. This is something a lot of us in the policy world are grappling with. You can agree, you can disagree with policy, but when there's a process, you can kind of figure out who's arguing for what and what direction things are going. There's no really functioning policy process right now. You have a group of advisors around the president who essentially have, kissed the ring, so to speak. They're going to respond to where he is rather than, trying to lobby him in different directions. He does hear most definitely different types of arguments, but there's no clear understanding of how policy is being formulated. Things are very chaotic. Sometimes they're not always thought through. I think it's hard for us to accept that. We always think there's some big strategy just because there's a paper that says national security strategy. It's not really clear. So I can't really tell you the motivations, but I would say, anybody who's looked at the long history of animosity between the U.S. and Iran, it's no secret that any U.S. administration would be very happy to see the downfall of the Islamic Republic. They have been a very, very dangerous country from a U.S. interest perspective for a whole array of reasons. So I don't think it's that surprising. And probably because these protests seem bigger and more momentous. And really, the Iranian government was responding to them in a way that looked and still does probably seem existential.
Yeah.
And so there might have been a sense that, okay, maybe there's an opening now. And some of the inputs probably coming into the White House, and you hear this a lot in Israeli discourse, is that, Iran is on the back foot. Iran, since the June war, since the onslaught against the axis of resistance over the past year and a half to 2 years, this is the moment to strike. This is when finally, after 47 years, we can finally get rid of this regime, and they just need this extra push from us. So maybe there was a hope that just the rhetoric would help and that the U.S. wouldn't have to actually do anything.
So, if you and I were to have had this conversation 2 days ago, and again, we're speaking on Thursday, January 15th, I would have expected an American attack to be imminent. The United States evacuated non-essential personnel from its major air base, from its major base in Qatar, and all the signals and signs seem to be pointing towards an imminent American strike. But over the last 24 hours or so, that now seems a bit potentially less likely for a few reasons. One of which is that there seems to be this regional full court diplomatic press against American military action in Iran. You had Netanyahu speak yesterday, I believe, with Trump warning him or urging him not to attack Iran at this moment. You've seen the Saudis, the Qataris, the other Gulf allies warning against an American strike on Iran at this moment. Why is that? What's the regional logic at play here?
Yeah. I also think that while it looks like at the moment there's a pause and an off-ramp, and the regional players are a big part of that, we should remember that in June, in the June war, it was just days before the B-2 bombers struck the 3 nuclear sites in Iran that President Trump was saying, we'll still see. We're not hopeful, but we'll still see if we can get a deal. And there were diplomats were supposed to meet for like the 6th round of talks through the Omanis who were mediating that talk to try to get a new deal back then.
There is this, interesting, to me at least, regional push warning Trump against taking this action at this moment from seemingly very different actors with different interests here. Why is that?
Well, I think we need to disaggregate the Israelis from the Gulf and the
Yeah.
Arab side. Now, I think from the Gulf Arab angle and the Saudis, the Emiratis not so much, but it's the Saudis, the Qataris, the Omanis in particular. Their perspective is no different than it was. This was probably what they were telling President Trump in June. They were not looking for a military attack then either, and they did not win the day in that point in time. But their argument, and right now it seems to have succeeded, is this is going to destabilize the region. This has a cost. This is not just a question of the Iran context. Their concern is that this instability, if it led to the collapse of the Iranian government, it could be chaotic. They don't know what the day after is. But even if it doesn't, more military strikes could lead to Iranian retaliation. It's not hypothetical. We already saw that in June when Iran retaliated against the U.S. base in Qatar and our largest base in the region. And yes, while it was kind of orchestrated and choreographed, that's still missiles flying over the region. And then the other concern is, of course, instability in the global oil markets and how this would affect that. So there's a number of reasons. I mean, the short version is war is very bad for business. And right now, these countries are very focused on domestic economic reform plans. So they're a very important and strong lobby cautioning against escalation. And I think, they seem to have quite a bit of influence, especially in this administration with all the deal making going on. You saw the president's first trip again was to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia. So he takes those phone calls. And so that has influence. The Israeli angle, I think, is really interesting here. And that has less to do with strategically, they're just opposed to it because actually it's quite the opposite. The Israelis do not feel the job was done.
I mean, they were cheerleading the attack in June, but now the tone is different. Why is that?
Well, the difference is the June attack was very much a very planned operation. Obviously, when you see how much intelligence penetration had to go into that to target in the early hours, especially specific IRGC leaders, nuclear scientists, kind of the precision, of course, it became more widespread and the ambitions were probably broader than just the nuclear based on Netanyahu's statements. Even then, he was talking about rise up Iranian people and attacking Evin prison and such. But it was a very planned attack and kind of part of their very, careful and calculated attempt to degrade first Iran's proxies and then Iran itself. So they had put a lot of effort into that. I think the concern this time is there wasn't a lot of thinking through. These protests just kind of came up and surprised everyone. And then I think a lot of people were equally surprised at President Trump himself, his initial responses, which were, very much kind of moving things faster than maybe many expected. So I think the Israeli motivation here is probably concern that they're not prepared to deal with Iranian retaliation in a way that they would feel they would need to be. Because we need to go back to the June war to understand that by the end of those 12 days, first of all, it cost billions of dollars in missile defense to, protect Israel and minimize casualties and damage. But there are not infinite numbers of missile defense systems and capabilities. And Iranian missiles were starting to get through into populated areas. And so the Israelis are going to be very attuned to being prepared if there is a military escalation. My guess is they did not feel that the moment was right, which is why I think story is not over. And just in November, things just move so fast right now. I mean, the Israelis were very focused on the missile problem, the remaining missile capabilities in Iran, and the fact that the Iranians have been actively replenishing and their capabilities since June. I've heard briefings from former Israeli officials that they just didn't think the U.S. had much of a strategy since the war. They degraded, but there was no follow-up, and they felt the Iranians were really recouping too quickly. And so, there's a lot of appetite for another operation against Iran. So that's why I don't think this story is over. But in terms of this moment, it was done very chaotically. And I think so there was a convergence in this instance of the Israelis and some of the Gulf partners that striking Iran in this context was not going to be a good idea. Again, the story's not over and things could change by tomorrow. But for the time being, that is the state of play.
So, like the conventional wisdom among like the foreign policy types is that Iran is just as weak as it has ever been for a number of reasons. The so-called axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Hamas have all been terribly degraded over the last couple of years. The Israeli strikes and the American strikes further degraded Iran's military capabilities. Meanwhile, Iran is under intense domestic pressure because of these protests, seem to be devoting a lot of resources towards repressing its own people. So I suppose my question then, and I know this is something that you study really in depth, is, if there were to be an American strike, what might we expect from Iran? And might that response be weaker than we would imagine?
Yeah, I think there's a chance, and I think that's the worry, is it could be stronger than we might expect. Yes, they are weakened. There's no question. Sometimes the consensus in the foreign policy establishment is too much groupthink and a little bit off. I think in this case, it's kind of right. There's no question. But, being weak does not mean you can't still be dangerous. Not all capabilities are gone. And they held back to some extent because they were worried about retaliation back and the whole tit for tat. It was not in their interest to keep the escalation going back in June. But if they were less careful about where they wanted to target, it could be worse. Now, I think that could have given pause right now about the risk of an attack at this particular moment, especially because when you're weak and if the leadership is feeling in survival mode, and all indications are this is kind of where things are at. This is a fight for survival. They will be less restrained. And that's the worry. So whatever capabilities they have left, maybe they're not much. This is very hard to know, but we do know they still have a dedicated security force. There so far has not been fracturing. And they do still have not as much missile capacity, but still significant capacity. The Chinese have been helping there too. And so if they really thought this was it, either they increase the costs for Israel and the United States to try to protect themselves from further attacks. They could hit population centers. They could hit things. Maybe missile defense systems would work, but it could get very ugly. Escalation is very hard to control. It's controlled until it's not. And the room for miscalculation when there's this much paranoia and I think concerns about survival make escalation risks all that more serious, I think.
What are you looking towards that will suggest to you how this might play out in the coming days or weeks?
To me, in terms of domestic evolution, whether there's fracturing in the leadership, that is, I think, the most important thing. The second, of course, on the domestic Iran front is opposition and, a more coherent opposition and more of a movement developing. In 2022, it really was a movement. Here, it's just we want these guys gone, and there's not really a clear vision what's replacing them. The Iranian opposition is quite divided. The former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has been trying to stir things up, but there's a lot of debate about how much support he has in the country. Trump kind of threw him under the bus the other day. I think he did
He
an
lives in
interview with
Maryland,
Reuters.
right?
Yeah, he lives in the U.S. He hasn't been in the country since the revolution, obviously. There's a lot of intra-opposition divisions during the 22 protests and after there was an attempt to form an Iranian opposition coalition, and that fell apart. So there's a lot of questions about who would take over. But with President Trump kind of suggesting that he may not have support of the country, he basically said that in an interview, that's really going to make it hard for him to recuperate. So those are the signs to look for in terms of that. I think in terms of externally, in terms of, operationally a military attack, obviously a carrier movement to the region would be a big sign. A lot of times we won't know about the attack until, usually you don't know until after. And I think this is why it's so hard to predict what signposts to look for because this administration sends so many different messages. But I think, those would be the key ones that I would look for. You may point to whether diplomacy will resume. I don't have much confidence. Maybe some limited engagement will take place, but after what just happened, it's hard to see from either side anything transformative happening. So, I think the more likely play moving forward is going to be muddling through status quo. This is assuming there's no military strike. And then that opens up a whole trajectory of new consequences.
So lastly, is there a question I didn't ask, a point you wanted to make, or more broadly, something that you think the more general foreign policy community doesn't quite capture in nuance about this unfolding situation?
One of the concerns I've always had, and it really is underscored here, is just how quickly we normalize the idea of, oh, yeah, sure, military force. There's a problem with Iran, military force. That's the way to do it.
That's why I'm interviewing you, not John Bolton.
Yeah. So I think it's really important
Yeah.
to step back and say, okay, do we have non-military tools to help the problem? Because usually, more often than not, military force often makes things worse or is not the most effective tool to achieve your goals. If you want to protect protesters, that could really backfire. A military strike, it feeds into kind of regimes' narratives. It's a very blunt instrument for toppling regimes. Historically, we know this from lots and lots of research that air power generally doesn't get rid of leaderships. Iran is not Venezuela, this idea of a decapitation strike. So all of these things, I think we need to pause before jumping to these military so-called solutions, but also really scrutinize what would they achieve and what would they not be able to achieve. And I think that would give us a better sense of maybe we should put those aside for a bit and think about other options. And there's been a lot of good work, and many have talked about these things. I have alternatives that we should be focusing on, of course, helping Iranians with communications, trying to circumvent the censorship, the blackout that they're facing, but also, supporting NGOs and human rights organizations that unfortunately the US is defunding. And that's a big problem because, like other tools, we're not able to use anymore because we've taken ourselves out of the system of organizations that use those tools. But like, if we want accountability in the future for the crimes underway, we need to be supporting institutions that are monitoring disinformation and, the abuse of doctored videos and so forth, just so we have real information about what's happening. We should be marshaling our diplomatic resources around the world. That's not easy to do when we've withdrawn from over 60 international organizations, civil society, human rights, democracy organizations. So all of those kinds of things I wish people in Washington would put more emphasis on. But this is not the current direction of this administration. It's an administration that is showing itself to think that military force is a useful and low-cost way to try to at least demonstrate, toughness, and they think it's working. In the Iran case, I think this pause is good news. It's suggesting there may be a little more thinking with Iran, that maybe this is a little more complicated than Venezuela, and we don't even know how Venezuela is ending for that matter. But it's really worrying that we are dismantling any alternative tools we can use to try to improve these very difficult situations, like when you face an uprising like we're seeing in Iran right now.
Dalia, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And thank you all for watching this live stream. I love doing these live streams and getting experts like Dalia on the show to share with you all their expertise. Please support Global Dispatches with a paid subscription. Every paid subscription goes a very long way to enabling me to continue to bring you this great content. So thank you so much, Dalia.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.